What's up guys, Lon here from Android Authority, and today we're taking a look at two of the hottest smartphones on the market right now with the Moto Z and the Galaxy S7 Edge. The Moto Z is completely different from anything we've ever seen from Motorola, and it brings something very unique to the table with its Moto Mods, but how does it stack up to arguably one of the best and most well-rounded smartphones from Samsung with the S7 Edge? Now, something to keep in mind with this comparison is there is a Forced edition of the Moto Z, which has a few key differences, and I'll point out what those are as we go through this comparison. Kicking things off with the design and build quality, both of these phones are made of some very high quality materials, look fantastic, and feel extremely sturdy. The Moto Z is made of a combination of glass on the front and back with a smooth metal frame holding it all together. The corners have been rounded off to make it feel more comfortable in the hand, and there is a subtle curve with the front glass, but for the most part this phone is completely flat on the front and back, with the only exception being that large protruding camera lens. The Galaxy S7 Edge is also made of glass and metal, but unlike the Moto Z, you have curves pretty much everywhere, from the tapers on the backside, the rounded corners, and the curved edge front glass. It's one of the most solid and comfortable feeling phones that Samsung has ever made, and overall it's just a very sleek and eye-catching design. The camera lens on the S7 does protrude just slightly, but it's nowhere near as drastic as the Moto Z, and from most angles it's not even noticeable. The downside to a phone made predominantly of glass is that it makes it a complete fingerprint magnet, so you either have to deal with cleaning it on a regular basis or use a skin or a case. With the Moto Z, you can take advantage of the Moto Mods and slap on a style shell cover to give the phone a little bit of extra flair, and it also adds enough thickness to hide that camera bulge. While we're on the subject of Moto Mods, we might as well talk about them. Right now there's only a few, like the JBL speaker, the projector, and the Incipio power pack, but there should be more coming as more third-party manufacturers jump on board and create these Moto Mods. These Moto Mods are definitely the biggest selling point to buying a Moto Z, and if you like how they work and the extra functionality that they add, then you'll probably like them. Just keep in mind that they're not exactly cheap, and all of them add a significant amount of thickness to the phone. By itself, the Moto Z is extremely thin at a hair over 5mm, and it's very impressive how thin Motorola managed to make this phone. The Moto Z Force, on the other hand, is slightly thicker at 7mm, but it's still a very thin phone. You really have to hold it in your hand to truly appreciate it, but despite how thin the Moto Z is, it's actually larger than the S7 Edge in every other dimension and has a much bigger footprint. Even though they share identical screen sizes at 5.5 inches, Samsung has managed to make the S7 Edge a much more compact phone by having a smaller top and bottom chin, thinner bezels, and curving down the glass on the left and right sides. Both of these phones carry a microSD card slot for expandable storage, which is always a very useful feature to have, but where you'll notice a huge difference is on the bottom. The Moto Z has a USB Type-C port, whereas the S7 Edge has a micro USB port, but the S7 Edge has a headphone jack, while Motorola chose not to include one on the Moto Z, which means you'll have to use an adapter with your headphones. The Moto Z does have a better sounding speaker, and it's located on the front of the phone, which is a much better location than Samsung's bottom firing speaker, but if we're being perfectly honest here, neither one of these speakers are that impressive, but you have the JBL speaker to make up for this deficiency on the Moto Z. The speaker on the S7 Edge is also very muffled and distorted due to the built-in water and dust resistance, but I think most people will agree that this is a small price to pay to have this type of protection on their phone. The Moto Z is also water resistant, but it doesn't carry an IP rating like the S7 does. This means that the Moto Z can survive a splash or a small spill, but it won't survive being submerged. Like I mentioned earlier, both the Moto Z and S7 Edge are rocking a 5.5-inch display, and they're both AMOLED screens with a resolution of 2560 by 1440. This gives off a very high pixel density, making them both super sharp, and they're both very vibrant, saturated, and full of deep inky blacks. The S7 Edge's screen is just a tad brighter and has slightly better viewing angles, but otherwise they're very comparable displays, and media like games and YouTube videos look absolutely fantastic on them. One benefit to the S7 Edge is that it also has an always-on display, which lights up only the necessary pixels to let you see important information like the time, date, battery life, the calendar, and notifications. The Moto Z doesn't have an always-on display, but it does have something very similar with Moto Display, which is still one of the best features to ever grace Android. It'll periodically pulsate anytime you have notifications, or you can manually wake it by picking up the phone or simply waving your hand over it. Another thing worth mentioning is if you happen to have the Moto Z Force, you're also getting a Shatterproof display that's much more durable over the standard Gorilla Glass displays of the Moto Z and the S7 Edge. Sitting right below the displays of the Moto Z and the S7 Edge are the fingerprint sensors, but the main difference between these two fingerprint sensors is that the S7's doubles as a home button, whereas the Moto Z's does not, regardless of how much you want to treat it like one. As far as accuracy and reliability, they both work extremely well, but the Moto Z's is going to feel a tad bit quicker since its fingerprint sensor starts reading your print the second you touch it, while on the S7, you have to press down the home button first before it starts reading your print. Even though the Moto Z's fingerprint sensor is not a home button, it does function as a lock key to put the phone back to sleep, which I personally think is a really nice touch. Like every other flagship that has come out this year, the Moto Z and the S7 Edge are packing identical specs with the Snapdragon 820 and 4GB of RAM. I won't harp on the performance too much, but these are both blazing fast phones and can handle anything you throw at them from web browsing, multitasking, and high-end games. Despite offering two very different Android experiences, they're both very fluid phones and you'd be hard-pressed to notice much of a difference between the two. As far as battery life goes, the Moto Z has a 2600 mAh battery, while on the S7 Edge you're looking at a much larger 3600 mAh battery, but the playing field is a little more even if you're comparing the Moto Z Force, which has a 3500 mAh battery. Obviously, battery life is going to vary based on usage, and the Moto Z can get through a full day, but you're going to be able to do that much more comfortably on the Moto Z Force and the S7 Edge. Both of these phones do have fast charging, so they're very easy to fill up, and in the case of the S7 Edge, you also have fast wireless charging, but if you really want to extend the Moto Z's battery life, it's as easy as slapping on the Incipio Power Pack, which to me is currently the most useful and practical Moto Mod on the market. Taking a look at the cameras, you won't find anything too crazy going on here like a dual lens setup, but what you will find is a 13 megapixel rear shooter with f1.8 aperture, optical image stabilization, and a dual tone LED flash on the Moto Z. If you have the Moto Z Force, this bumps up to 21 megapixels, but everything else remains the same. The S7 or S7 Edge comes with a 12 megapixel sensor, f1.7 aperture, optical image stabilization, and a blazing fast dual pixel autofocusing system that allows it to focus much faster than any other smartphone camera currently on the market. The Moto Z's camera software keeps things pretty simple by only offering the most basic of camera modes, whereas the S7 gives you a bevy of options with different modes and camera effects, but both cameras do offer manual controls. If I had to pick either one of these cameras, I'd definitely go with the S7 Edge. The Moto Z can take some decent photos, but it really pales in comparison to the S7. The S7's photos are sharper and more detailed with better dynamic range, whereas the Moto Z has the tendency to overexpose and blow out highlights. The S7's camera is also the much faster camera overall. In low light, the Moto Z is really slow to capture, especially if you're using HDR, while the S7 is still really fast to focus and capture photos thanks to that dual pixel autofocus. The S7 does have some troubles with white balance in low light, but the photos are still much more detailed over the photos of the Moto Z. One of the best parts about Motorola phones is that they keep the software experience pretty close to stock. The Moto Z is running Android Marshmallow, and it's as close to stock as you're going to get without being a Nexus. Motorola's customizations to Android also keeps things pretty light, but they're also some of the most useful features we've ever seen on an Android phone. Of course, you have Moto Display, which I mentioned earlier, but you also have things like Moto Voice to call upon your Moto Z from across the room, and the various Moto actions like the double chop to turn on the camera flash, and the ever so useful double twist of the wrist to launch the camera. The only real downside with the Moto Z being a Verizon exclusive at the moment is that it comes with a crap ton of Verizon bloatware and a bunch of other pre-installed games and apps. There's an unlocked version coming soon which won't have any of this bloatware, but it's something that you'll have to deal with if you decide to jump on the Moto Z right now. The S7 Edge is also running Android Marshmallow, but it has Samsung's usual TouchWiz skin, which changes a lot of the look and feel of Android, but Samsung has done a better job with it recently, and it's a much cleaner and less bloaty experience than it has been in years past. With the S7 Edge, you also have the Edge panels that can give you quick access to apps, sports scores, the weather, your contacts, and a variety of other shortcuts just by swiping in from the Edge glass. They can be useful, but like many other new features on a smartphone, you have to train yourself to get used to them, or else you'll just forget about them. The Moto Z and the S7 Edge are two really fantastic smartphones in their own right, but what it's really going to come down to is how much you value Moto Mods and how easily you can get your hands on one of these smartphones. The S7 Edge is the easier phone to get right now with availability on all carriers, but if you really want the Moto Z and you can't hold out for the unlocked version, Verizon is currently your only option. The Moto Z is a very solid smartphone on its own, and the Moto Mods is just icing on the cake. It's a very elegant way of modifying your smartphone, and if you're willing to spend the extra money, you won't be disappointed. The S7 Edge doesn't have any crazy bells and whistles or extra moving parts, but it is an all-around great smartphone that ticks all the right boxes, and for most people that's going to be more than enough to suit their needs. But let us know what you guys think of the Moto Z and the S7 Edge down in the comments below, and if you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, and also subscribe to the channel, which is also down below if you haven't already, so you don't miss out on our future videos. And feel free to follow us on social media like Instagram, Snapchat, Twitter, Google+. All that stuff will be linked down below, and check out the website as well, androidauthority.com, because we are your source for all things Android.